By March 1865, Confederate General Lee realized that he could not hold out much longer. His army was racked by desertion, disease, and a chronic shortage of supplies. The defensive stalemate only prolonged the inevitable defeat. In addition, Lee knew that Grant would receive potentially well over 100,000 reinforcements as General Sheridan would return from the Shenandoah Valley, and General Sherman, having decimated the southern heartland, was heading north through the Carolinas to join up with Grant. Unbeknownst to Lee, Grant had already planned an offensive to begin the 29th. On March 25, 1865, Lee attempted a breakout and attacked the Union lines. Initially, the Confederates made advances and captured the Union Fort Statesman, but a Union artillery attack and reinforcements ringed in the Confederates, driving them back. The Union repulse actually gained ground for the Federals and set back the now weakened Confederate defenses. On March 28th, Grant met with President Lincoln, General Sherman, and Navy Admiral David Porter at the now famous conference aboard the River Queen at City Point, Virginia. In the meeting, the leaders discussed their strategy for the end of the war and the reconstruction to follow. On April 2nd, after a series of smaller battles and a decisive Union victory at the Battle of Five Forks, cutting the last supply lines to the Confederate Army, Grant launched a massive attack against the defenses of Petersburg. The attack, along much of the Confederate line, resulted in a decisive breakthrough at a location known as Boydton Plank Road. Grant himself galloped through the broken Confederate lines toward the front to instruct the advance in person, coming under rebel artillery fire for nearly 15 minutes. With the pause in the fire, Grant remarked, "The enemy seems to have the range of this place. Suppose we ride away." Additional Union breakthroughs convinced Lee that he needed to abandon Richmond and Petersburg. Lee wrote to Confederate President Jefferson Davis, "I see no prospect of doing more than holding our position here until night. I am not certain I can do that. I advise that all preparations be made for leaving Richmond tonight. I will advise you later according to circumstances." At 3 p.m., Lee gave the order to withdraw from Richmond and Petersburg. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia withdrew along both sides of the Appomattox River, while President Davis, much of his cabinet, official records, and the gold held in the Confederate treasury left on the Richmond and Danville train for Danville, Virginia. Richmond and Petersburg officially fell to Grant's army the next day on April 3rd. Grant entered Petersburg and took cover at a house, as the Confederate bullets were still filling the air even in their retreat. Grant later met with President Lincoln at Petersburg for a 90-minute conference, then headed west to join his army, now chasing after Lee. Grant and Badeau both wrote that the Confederate government, upon abandoning Richmond, had raided the liquor shops and dumped the spirits into the gutters, whereupon the locals were seen filling their buckets from the gutters. Richmond then erupted in fire. For the next 6 days, Lee's army was in full retreat towards Lynchburg, Virginia, where Lee hoped to find supplies. Grant's Union forces were in hot pursuit and continued to attack the Confederates. Hundreds of exhausted Confederate troops surrendered. Lee tried to get supplies for his army along the path of retreat, but foraging was poor and Union forces intercepted both his attempts to message ahead for more supplies and any trains loaded with supplies. An intercepted personal letter from Confederate Colonel William B. Taylor tersely summed up the rebel army's condition. "Dear Mama, our army is ruined, I fear." On April 6th, at the Battle of Sailor's Creek, Union forces captured nearly 8,000 Confederate prisoners, nearly 1/5 of the remaining army. On the night of April 7th, Grant sent a letter to Lee proposing that Lee surrender. Lee, in what might have been a delaying move, requested Grant's terms of surrender. Lee, although not surrendering, did offer to meet. On the 9th, Grant wrote to Lee again and refused the meeting, but expressed hope that the difficulties may be settled without the loss of another life. On that day, Confederate forces attacked the Union lines, broke through, and took a nearby ridge, but upon reaching the top, saw a massive line of Union soldiers. By now, Lee's army was surrounded on 3 sides, and after some additional fighting, Lee realized it was over and is quoted as saying, "Then there is nothing left for me to do but to go and see General Grant, and I would rather die 1,000 deaths." Badeau wrote, "The fact is, unless he quickly submitted to whatever terms Grant chose to impose, he and every man in his army would be annihilated." Grant and Lee, along with attending staff, met at the house of Mr. Wilmer McLean in the town of Appomattox Courthouse. Grant arrived, dressed in what he described as rough garb, wearing essentially a common private's uniform with the shoulder straps of a lieutenant general. Lee, on the other hand, was dressed in full uniform, wearing a formal display sword. Grant wrote that he could not discern Lee's emotions at the time, but that for himself he felt no rejoicing. At the downfall of a foe who had fought so long and valiantly and had suffered so much for a cause, though that cause was, I believe, one of the worst for which a people ever fought, and one for which there was the least excuse. Their conversation grew pleasant as they remembered each other from their time in the Mexican-American War. But once back on track, Lee accepted Grant's terms and surrendered his army at 3 p.m. that April 9th. Grant's terms were generous and allowed that Confederate combatants would not be prosecuted or imprisoned and would retain their horses and mules to farm their lands. Officers were allowed to keep their sidearms. Other arms and Army public property were handed over to the Union Army. Lee requested, and Grant then provided, rations to the starving Confederates from those previously captured. Grant's adjutant, Eli S. Parker, a Native American of the Seneca tribe, hand-wrote the terms of surrender. Parker later commented that General Lee looked at him, extended his hand, and said, "I'm glad to see one real American here." Parker shook his hand and replied, "We are all Americans." On that day, Parker was brevetted Brigadier General of Volunteers. Grant wrote in his memoirs that the much-celebrated ceremonial surrender of Lee's sword to Grant never occurred. History records that Lee's surrender on April 9th was the effective end of the American Civil War. On April 14th, President Lincoln invited Grant and his wife Julia to join him at Ford's Theater for a rendition of the famed play, Our American Cousin. Grant wrote that they agreed to attend, but only if he could not complete his work in Washington, D.C. and, as planned, leave town to visit his children. Grant did leave, and he and Julia declined the invitation. Major Henry Rathbone then joined the president at the theater. Other historical accounts suggest that Grant really declined the offer, as Julia and Mrs. Lincoln were on poor terms. At the play, Lincoln was shot by John Wilkes Booth. Booth had also planned to stab Grant, but instead stabbed Major Rathbone in the arm as Rathbone struggled to stop Booth. Lincoln died the next day. Vice President Andrew Johnson took over the presidency. Grant was seen weeping at Lincoln's funeral and later commented that Lincoln was the greatest man I had ever known. The final Confederate surrender occurred November 6, 1865, when the Confederate warship CSS Shenandoah surrendered in Liverpool, England. On August 20, 1866, President Andrew Johnson signed a proclamation officially ending the war. Of the Great War of the Rebellion, Grant concluded, "The cause will have to be attributed to slavery."